Paging Dr. Carroll. Paging Dr. Carroll.
Aaron Carroll.
He's Karen, and he shares it all.
Aaron Carroll.
He's blaring it out and bears it all.
He knows modern medicine dispels disinformation. He's a brilliant pediatrician. All that and then some. Aaron Carroll. He's the IUCHO. Does HSR, writes NYTO, and puts out HC
Paging Dr. Carroll. Dr. Carroll to the Shedio.
Yes, all-time favorite list, Dr. Aaron Carroll. It's so good to see you. I've missed you. Thank you for joining me today.
It's so good to see you, too. I'm looking forward to it.
A lot of people ask me, how come we didn't get you on surrounding the assassination of the healthcare executive? I was like, I don't know. I'll talk to him about it when I do. So here you are. Are you pro or anti-murder of wealthy healthcare executives?
It's hard even to joke. Of course, anti. I mean, it just, I tried actually to write a column for the New York Times at the time, but I'm sure they were loaded. And then I wound up doing another podcast that talks explicitly about this. But I mean, the anger, while I understand it and it is real, it is somewhat misguided to pick any one demon to say, like, they're the cause of what's wrong with the healthcare system. So much is wrong with it, and murder is obviously never the answer, and it did not achieve the goals of what anybody might be thinking, and it was just horrible, absolutely horrible. And I was actually somewhat sick at looking at, how many people reacted. I understand. Look, no one. I mean, I get the frustration with the American healthcare system as much as anyone. That's all we've been like yelling about for the last, 20 years. It feels like almost, but this is not the solution, and it's misguided.
I think what I'm hearing you say, and I heard that interview, it was really good, actually, that you did, is that it's not just the healthcare insurance, it's the cost of healthcare, which is what insurance may or may not pay out. It's hospitals, it's doctors, it's treatment, it's drugs, it's therapies, it's procedures, it's many, many things that cause the cost in the U.S. to be the way it is. That's what I felt like you could talk for hours about and have.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, like at the end of the day, insurance is pushing money around. It's taking money from over here and pushing it over there. Theoretically, it's supposed to go from the healthy to the sick. It is a wealth transfer in some ways. But, the problem in America is that healthcare is just so expensive, and it keeps getting more expensive, and we just keep using tons and tons of it. And so if we're not willing to negotiate to lower the prices through hardcore negotiations with providers and hospitals and hardcore negotiations with drug companies and devices, if we're not willing to do that, and we're not willing to pay more in terms of premiums, then we've sort of stuck everything onto insurance to be the gatekeeper, to say, like, they're the last thing standing between ridiculous costs and what we've got right now. So they've got to find ways to say no and to figure out what should be paid for and what shouldn't. Bad actors exist, not going to deny it, and profit motives are problematic, but we have foisted much of the responsibility onto insurance. And whether it's public insurance or private insurance or whatever it is, that is who is left to say no. And we've either got to tackle this holistically, or we've got to accept that is the role of insurance these days.
There are literally very few other people in the world who understand the rest of the world's healthcare systems the way that you do. You've done a tremendous amount of research. You've visited many of these countries. So I always want to ask you, like, who does it better in terms of, because we're always talking about quality, cost, and access, right? The three-legged stool of healthcare that you taught us about. But in terms of cost, like, is there any one thing that you could look at another country that does, or even that we do in the U.S. with Medicare or the veterans, like that we could be like, this is just a no-brainer, and then more importantly, could somehow get through Congress?
Well, I mean, I think, what almost all other countries do better is sort of manage the prices. They just don't allow people to charge whatever they want, and they often have complex negotiations. And, it's not all socialism. A lot of them are private health insurance. Switzerland is my favorite go-to example. It's an entirely private health insurance system, birth to death, mostly nonprofit, but you can buy for-profit insurance. But how do they keep the spending down? Well, there's a fair amount of cost sharing, but more importantly, they set the rates of reimbursement. They, go through canton by canton, think of it state by state, and they say this is what we're going to pay for X, and all private insurance will pay that. And if you do that, then that is one way to bring costs down. They set what they will pay for drugs. They set what they will pay for a variety of things. Medicare tries to do this, but it doesn't do it very well on drugs with the recent what's the word I'm looking for? My God, with the one thing that they have is the recent Biden administration negotiating for the first time the first 10 drugs. I think I wrote a piece on that a couple months ago, but that's the one exception. Other than that, we don't negotiate Medicare with drug companies. And Medicare does try to negotiate for rates and in fact does pay lower rates often than private insurance does. But, they're still very, very permissive in what they will cover and and what they will pay for. And so it's all very, very expensive. And what other countries do better, short answer again, is they negotiate and they focus on the prices and they make sure they're not paying too much.
Isn't there a cultural issue where in a lot of other nations and other countries, they realize that you're going to die someday, and in America, we think we're going to live forever, and therefore we demand every treatment, everything at, by the way, affordable costs? I mean, is there something?
Yeah. I don't know if I would say it goes that far because, again, if you look at what other countries they get versus what we do, it's not the volume of care that makes our system so much more expensive. And this has been looked at multiple times. Most known by Uwe Reinhardt in his really well-known piece in Health Affairs. It was called "It's the Price is Stupid" was actually the title of the paper. And they recently reissued it a couple of years ago, and it was the title I think was "It's Still the Price is Stupid."
Right.
Because it's not the volume of care. It's again the prices. It's that everything costs more here, not necessarily that we use more of it. Now, we know that end of life care is super expensive in the United States, but that's just because that's when we use a lot of care, when people are towards the end. And you never know in advance when the last 6 months are. You can't. So when do you cut that? How do you know? So we keep trying to cut volume. We keep trying to say no, which is what insurance does. And we keep trying to get people not to use care, which is what all the cost sharing is about and everything else. But at the heart of it, the real problem is the prices.
Got it. And we can always learn a lot more about that, talk more about that. Let me ask you about this incoming Trump administration. Here we are, Aaron. Hard to believe, but it's where we're at. And the headlines when it comes to health are a lot about, the cabinet secretary, specifically the fact that RFK Jr. is going to be the HHS secretary. It's hard to believe given the history of our conversations around vaccines and research and scientific evidence and science communication and so on. But here we are. So what are your, what kind of concerns do you have specifically about that main issue that everybody seems to talk about in terms of vaccines? It would seem like one of the worst things that could happen is that you could allow people to make vaccines optional for schools, and then you could have measles outbreaks and a lot of kids could get really sick. What is the worst case possible outcome around what the federal government may or may not do around vaccines, and what do you have to say about it?
Vaccines are one of the greatest, public health achievements of the, in the history of humanity, but certainly in the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years. Not to mention even further back if you look back. But it's disheartening to see us go backwards. There are diseases we've eradicated. There are diseases that used to be major causes of childhood morbidity and mortality, not to mention even adults that are now so much less than they used to be. So, obviously falling away from that or abandoning that is concerning. I don't want to overplay it because for a variety of reasons. One, in that I think the more we normalize not getting vaccinated, the more people don't get vaccinated. And sometimes, we scream too loudly about small percentages of people not getting vaccinated because we want it to be 100%. But, we're doing more harm than good. The other thing is that these diseases aren't going to roar back overnight. It's not as if polio all of a sudden is going to start, going all the way through America. What will happen more likely is that there will just be outbreaks. Just as we've seen more measles outbreaks, it feels like in the last decade than probably previously. But they're usually contained to a smallish environment. They usually affect disproportionately the people who haven't been vaccinated, and they're terrible. But you don't want to grandstand too much and say like, oh my God, all of a sudden there'll be measles outbreaks throughout the United States and everyone will be at risk. That's not likely to happen quickly, especially because most of us are already vaccinated against it anyway. But falling away from that and losing ground on something that's so great and so easily obtained is incredibly disheartening.
In terms of other parts of this incoming administration, I know you're concerned about Medicaid cuts. Yeah. There's a lot of headlines that people see, but there's a lot that someone like yourself pays closer attention to that's going to, probably impact large scale, vulnerable communities, potentially kids, people living in poverty, people with congenital illnesses or rather chronic illnesses. So what else are you concerned about with the Trump administration coming in?
So, if they have a pretty ambitious and expensive agenda, including extending the tax cuts they passed in 2017. Doing so is going to cost like more than $4 trillion over a decade. And where do you get that kind of money if you don't want to explode the deficit? It's very hard to cut enormous parts of money outside of the federal budget unless you're sort of going to go after what people think of as entitlement spending. And if you're unwilling to touch Medicare and you're unwilling to touch Social Security, you're really not so, and you're unwilling to touch the military, and you can't really touch interest on the debt, you're left with Medicaid. And so proposals being sort of floated around that started getting announced last week include enormous cuts in the order of $2+ trillion to Medicaid. But how do you do that? 75% of Medicaid spending goes to kids, disabled Americans, and the elderly. It's not as if they can go work, any of those groups. It's not as if they can raise more money for themselves. Yeah. They're somewhat dependent. Where do you make the cuts? And it's like there's lots of gimmicks that they can use and lots of trying to push it around. But the reality is Medicaid is a very lean program. It's pretty efficient. It already reimburses less than most other insurance programs, including Medicare, including private insurance. And cutting it will have real world consequences.
It would seem, when you think about the history of the federal government's involvement in healthcare and healthcare spending, it would seem that it's only gone up and up with both Democrats and Republicans. Before Obama and Obamacare, President Bush passed a huge, very expensive, unpaid for, put on the credit card, new element of Medicare, Part B,
Part
C?
D.
That was passed. So is it true that generally, whether it be Democrat or Republican, when they make healthcare announcements, advancements, legislation, it's usually more spending? Meaning, my question is, usually we don't cut healthcare spending from the federal government, but I don't pay that close attention to it.
They have. We during the last Trump administration, they enacted Medicaid cuts and they enacted work requirements in a variety of states through waivers, and they did a lot of this. And then,
but the work requirements were state laws, right?
They were because again, it's important to remember Medicaid is a state program.
Right.
And so what they did initially was use waivers to allow states to try to see what would happen. Like, this is a good way to, and they did. And we did studies and it turns out they don't really work. Like, we did not see employment increase. We did see lots of people drop from the rolls, and so, now they're trying to move that to make it though a federal, they can move it federal and be like, we're going to make it federal legislation. They can also move to block grants, which they've tried before. Because right now, Medicare, like Medicare, is an open-ended entitlement program and that they pay for what people use in terms of care. Instead of doing that and calling it which is called a defined benefit, they could move it to what's called a defined contribution and just say like, look, we're just going to pay X amount per person, give states the cash, let them figure it out. That's just passing the buck. It just makes it, puts the hard decisions on states because at the end of the day, it's all about spending less. And if there was a magical, innovative way for states to spend way less to give the same benefits, they'd do it.
Right.
Because Medicaid already costs them a fortune. No one is excited about paying more for health care, but everybody assumes there's some kind of magic, innovative solution just around the corner.
Okay, I want to ask you about nutrition. As much as you are an expert on health insurance, healthcare in many ways, you're also the author of the Bad Food Bible and the host of YouTube's Healthcare Triage, which has almost 500,000 subscribers. It's a big deal channel. It's won journalism awards, you and your team there. And I always love talking about this. So I guess my question is specifically, the first one is, have you seen any headlines coming out of reputable or not as reputable media outlets that refer to studies that you're like, oh gosh, this is like clickbait? Because so often I feel like there are journalists interpreting studies either wrong or the study's just not great, and then they, start talking about it for clickbait. So whether it be about sugar or ultra-processed foods or anything, it can be, new drugs. I mean, so I'm giving you, is there anything that comes to mind there? You're like, oh, this is not great. This is really inaccurate. Nothing?
Well, I mean, no, I was going to say like every day.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Like all the time. I mean, I've gotten so many emails over the last week asking me about, all of the headlines. It felt like a week or two ago about alcohol, where the Surgeon General was making a pronouncement about alcohol and cancer and, new reports. And it felt like I could have republished, I think, the last column I wrote on this, which was probably like in 2018. I mean, almost nothing has changed. There's no new data or evidence. There's no new studies. Like, they haven't had any new blockbuster proof. It's the same old cohort and case control studies that they throw into the mill and see what comes out. And it's somewhat political at this point, and it's somewhat overblown in conflating relative risk with, absolute risk. And it is, somewhat sort of prescriptive in the idea where they're saying like no amount is safe. I wrote back in 2018, like no amount of dessert is safe. I'm sure I can make a chart showing you that for each additional dessert you eat, your life, bad things happen. No amount of skiing is safe. But stuff we do every day has risk, and you have to be okay with understanding what's the absolute risk for what I'm engaging in. And if there's some value to people for it, and you shouldn't overprescribe the value of alcohol, certainly, but, to make proclamations like we should be, no amount of X is safe, I could do that about everything.
Right.
Driving, going outside, being in the sun, after a while, if you're just going to say, well, no amount of X is safe, you just have lost the battle. And when it comes to warning labels, you can throw a warning label on everything, but eventually then people stop paying attention to the warning labels. And I remember writing about that with respect to California, and I can't remember which prop it is, but where they have to throw, warning labels at every Starbucks to say that coffee has acrylamide and acrylamide causes cancer. Yeah, okay, but you can't literally make coffee without acrylamide. It's impossible. Just roasting the beans makes acrylamide. Why? Because anytime you cook, bake, broil, basically do anything to starch, it creates acrylamide. And the vast majority of calories that we consume contain acrylamide. And yes, acrylamide, if pumped in enormous amounts into rats under their skin, it causes cancer. But coffee doesn't cause cancer even. We've done studies. In fact, the WHO took coffee off of its warning list. I like to think I might have had something to do with that, with all the articles I wrote about it. But they took coffee off, but because of California's laws, they still have to put up the warning signs because of the acrylamide. It makes no sense. And after a while, people are going to just stop paying attention to anything if you're always screaming that you should not do anything.
Acrylamide is, you can also get it by harvesting a child's blood at a heightened state of fear. Is that right?
I don't know that. It's possible, but I don't know.
Is that acrylamide?
I wouldn't recommend doing that either.
You've done a ton of videos, and I'm not looking up your articles, maybe more importantly, but about alcohol, including one, alcohol and cancer and how we think about risk. That's 6 years ago. And you're saying there's nothing new on that. All right.
There hasn't been a new randomized controlled trial or something proving that alcohol causes cancer. Well, there haven't even been any new major really blockbuster, studies that have found something that we didn't already know.
Aren't you in the pocket of big booze though? Because you like whiskey, and here's a video. Booze isn't all bad, sponsored by Jack Daniels. Now that seems corrupt.
That's a lie. That's a dirty lie.
That's a dirty lie. Like you're compromised.
Yes, that would be a major conflict of interest.
You wouldn't even take a sponsor from such a lowbrow whiskey as my actual.
Well, that's the thing is that you can't imagine that I would accept a sponsorship from Jack Daniels.
Right. Okay. So the headline I did see that I was like, I got to ask Aaron about this. And it's always, by the way, it's always interesting to note maybe what you're most getting asked about by people who have your email and text. Like when you mentioned like, oh, lately I've been getting a lot of emails. That's probably the question I should be asking you. What are you hearing about? Because it means that people are reading about it, hearing about it. And I'm betting you heard about the New York Times article, study links high fluoride exposure to low IQ in children. You have talked about fluoride for years.
I'm pretty sure the study was in JAMA Pediatrics where I'm an editor. So yeah, I know all about that study. Look, there are studies, most of them coming from outside the United States, that show that high levels of fluoride seem to be associated with problems with reductions in IQ in children. What's the absolute value? It's pretty small again, but it appears there's an association. But it's important to understand it's pretty high levels of fluoride, and it's often like not in the water. It's sometimes in the air or in other ways because they're just doing stuff that we don't do in America. So is there a link between high levels of fluoride ingested in certain ways and problems? Yes. Does that mean that they're at the levels that are in drinking water? No. And also it's important to understand like inhaling fluoride, no benefit. But, ingesting fluoride seems to have a significant benefit reducing cavities in children. And caries are like the most chronic childhood disease that I think we have, and it causes significant morbidity in lots of other ways. And so fluoridation of water with respect to improving teeth health is massively good. And so can we have a discussion about what the proper levels are and what to do? Sure. But we should not be extrapolating from what is seen over there and what we experience here.
It seems like, just real quick, the worst things to eat are sugar and ultra-processed foods. But we are going to eat them, but it seems like those are the worst things. Is that right? Is that fair?
I think added sugars are some of the hardest thing to defend in the world. Yeah, I mean, it seems like added sugars don't provide really much benefit at all, and maybe linked to real problems. It seems like maybe trans fats back in the day had significant things. And look, I think ultra-processed foods are a problem because they make it too easy to get more than you're thinking.
Right.
But do any of these, I guess trans fat got them in. Should any of these be banned? Probably not. I mean, again, if you ban added sugars, you just can't have dessert anymore. I mean, there's lots of things you just can't have. And we should work on reducing those things and being responsible about them. But I don't know if I go to bans. Same thing with ultra-processed foods. It's like, where do you draw the line? Pasta's processed. What are you going to do? Unless we want to all start milling our own wheat, lots of stuff is processed. And I think that we should limit those. And in fact, that's what I say in the Bad Food Bible. It's try to eat less ultra-processed foods. Try to eat less processed foods. Think about that in terms of the food pyramid of what you want the most of and what you want the least of. But, deciding that these are the sole cause of problems in America is somewhat problematic.
So many more questions. Let's do it again soon. I really appreciate all of this. We covered a lot. And last one, is there any other email that you're getting a lot of lately? I love that you brought that up. What are you hearing about? What are most people asking? And when does it come in? Is it like some headline,
Yeah, I mean, the alcohol thing, well, it's interesting you said it because I heard from lots of people at the New York Times who were like, hey, if you're not writing about this, can you at least tell me what you think? And that was the alcohol thing. I think, Medicaid, now I'm getting a lot of questions about Medicaid because the news broke last week about Medicaid cuts. Yeah. I've had a couple interesting calls recently more about infant feeding. I don't even know what brought that up.
Infant what?
Infant feeding, like people who had babies who wanted to talk about how they're feeding and difficulties they might be having, but I don't think that was based on news. I think it was just chance.
Oh, you can do this one real quick. It's topical. Sure. Milk and bird flu. And I guess if I mention both, it's a little longer, right? But unpasteurized milk, raw milk, you're outside of yourself. I know last time I was at your home, you made me a smoothie, but you said only you can drink this, which I thought was weird that you and your family wouldn't drink it. But mostly you're against it, except for your guests.
I like pasteurized milk because why why not? It's like, it makes things so much safer. You're less likely to, get sick or have anything else. Yes, it's a great thing. But if people want to drink raw milk, we're not, again, the absolute value is pretty low. It's like, when people get crazy about eating raw cookie dough and like you want to ban that too. And I'm like, look, you're taking on a risk. It's a pretty small risk, especially these days because eggs are so much cleaner. If we all went back to raw milk, we might see more problems, but we can't keep lumping everything into the same boat. The risk from raw milk is far less concerning to me than if we all stop vaccinating. Especially, again, because it's going to affect you, so be it. But on the other hand, pasteurization is great. Go ahead.
I have several chickens and ducks that I pal around with. Should I be worried about getting bird flu from them? And it should only be me, or should everybody? I mean, how worried are you about bird flu jumping to human beings?
I'm worried about it, again, from a population perspective. I'm not worried about Aaron Carroll or his family. So it's like I worry we don't take these things seriously enough, and we're not watching it. We're not building the infrastructure we need to be on top of these things. And so, yes, I'm concerned about sort of the country's response to bird flu as it's gone, but I'm not concerned that it's a real risk that I need to change my life over today. By the way, while we're back on milk, why are we all drinking so much milk? I don't understand. Why is everybody drinking so much milk? There just isn't that much of a reason for adults to be drinking so much milk anyway. So why?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm not going to defend it at all. I never buy it myself, but I think but it's good in cereal. I think. Yeah,
fine. It's great in cereal.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But I do think, and I have seen a few people in my life in the past, I don't know, decade drink or pour a glass of milk in front of me, and I've berated them and taken their numbers out of my phone. I think it's crazy. You're a grown adult. That's a weird. Oh, let me just have a full glass of milk. What do you?
I mean, the reason we drink so much milk is entirely political. We've made more than one episode of healthcare triage where we even have a character called the Milk Emperor. The idea being the emperor has no clothes. It's amazing to me how passionate adults get over cow's milk. I'm like, you don't need it. Okay, but who's like, I really need a glass of milk. If you're having it with an Oreo, great. If you want it with cereal, fine. But the amount of time we spend on it is baffling.
I would love. This is just anecdotal, and I would love some kind of blind study, but I do think there's a connection between predatory adults who drink milk. They're just trying to get kids. About that. I just made all of that up. But you would if I had my ducks and my chickens here, would you, Aaron Carroll, not want to be around them because you're worried about contracting bird flu? Would you pet my duck?
I'd probably pet your duck. Yes.
Okay. Well, then I think people that, have pets like mine should feel pretty safe if Aaron would pet them.
And again, I think again, it's like you're keeping them local. It's not, where are they going to get bird flu from? You?
Maybe.
They're not out socializing. They're just in their home. Whatever.
They're not inside.
If there was a dog flu tomorrow, the chance of Loki getting it is near zero. That he barely leaves the house, and he says, "Your dog." I wouldn't be worried about Loki.
I thought it was super weird. I'd never heard that about any species of dog. That your dog does not like to go for walks.
Oh no! The only way we can take Loki for a walk is to drive a mile away, get outside the car, at which point he will make a beeline for home. He has no interest at all. If you try to leave the house, he won't even make it to the bottom of the driveway before he's dug in. I am not walking away from this house.
Is that his breed?
I think it partially. I'm not kidding. When we were looking for a dog, we looked up on Google laziest dog breeds.
Okay.
And his was right at the top. And we wanted a dog as active as we wanted him to be, not as active as he needed to be.
Right.
He fits the bill.
Yeah, he does. He's so great. All right, bud. I love you. I appreciate you. Thank you for joining me today. All right.